One day, after gaining the throne, General Isamo Liu was chatting with his chief of staff, General Han Xin. "Liu, how do you rate me as a general?" "Han, I think your majesty can command, at most, an army of a few divisions." "Liu, and what is your own ability?" "Han, the more armies of as many possible divisions I command the better I work." "Liu, how does it happen that I am an emperor while you remain a general?" "Han, you are a born leader of leaders." Liu was one of the greatest emperors and Han one of the greatest generals in history. Few admirals have enjoyed such high reputation as did Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in World War II. He had great ability, but I feel that his reputation as a naval leader was greater than he deserved. I do not mean to compare Yamamoto categorically with Liu, but in respect of their actual abilities, they are comparable. Despite Japan's miserable defeat in the Pacific War, the nation is still inclined to regard Yamamoto as a hero. Post-war writings have criticized other military and naval leaders, but not Yamamoto. If my remarks on Yamamoto seem severe, it is not that I have any personal feelings against him. This is just the first writing by a Japanese military man to be at all critical of him. To me, Admiral Yamamoto was a born leader of leaders, and for that he deserved the almost religious respect accorded him. But he was not qualified to command 1,000,000 tons of ships and their crews. It was tragic that he was chosen to head the combined fleet. Many of my colleagues believe that Yamamoto would have been an ideal Navy minister, and there was a movement underway among certain naval officers to have him named to this post. Their idea was that Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai should command the combined fleet. That move collapsed when Yonai, who strongly opposed war, refused, saying, "I am not a fighting admiral, and would only make things worse with the army." Furthermore, if such a stiff-necked man as Yamamoto becomes Navy minister, he will surely be assassinated by army hotheads. The real trouble was the army. When the war began, the cabinet was headed by General Hideki Tojo. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada, the Navy minister, was known to be a Tojo stooge. The Navy Chief of Staff, Admiral Osami Nagano, was not strong enough to oppose army plans. In criticizing Yamamoto, his actions and inaction, consideration must be given to all these factors which served to hamstring him. Throughout his career, Yamamoto was known to be a superb gambler. He was skilled in all games of chance, especially poker. His decision to attack Pearl Harbor was a gamble which paid tremendous odds. It is strange, therefore, that Yamamoto never again played his cards for all they were worth, as a gambler should. The lessons of the Coral Sea battle were not applied to Midway, where Yamamoto split his forces to his detriment between his prime objective and the Aleutians. Yamamoto was undoubtedly preoccupied with preserving his forces. My survivor-laden Amatsukaze entered the quiet of Truk Harbor on the 25th of August, 1942. I fully expected to be ordered back to action as soon as our passengers went ashore. None of us in Amatsukaze imagined that we would stay more than a month at this haven during such a critical period of the war. At Truk I learned details of the Coral Sea Battle of May 7–8, which had taken place while I was vacationing at home, and subsequent actions. Japan's plans for an amphibious invasion of Port Moresby, a key Allied base on the southern coast of New Guinea, were thwarted as a result of this battle. Light carrier Shoho was sunk, and fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were so damaged that they could not take part in the Midway battle 1 month later. Against these losses, the Imperial Navy claimed a victory in having sunk 3 enemy carriers. The enemy's actual losses in this battle were carrier Lexington, oiler Neosho, and destroyer Sims sunk and carrier Yorktown damaged. There was no doubt that Japan suffered a stunning setback, despite the official claim of victory. 1 month later, Japan was crushingly defeated at Midway, where she lost carriers Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, and Soryu, and heavy cruiser Makuma. The U.S. Navy had carrier Yorktown repaired in time for Midway to Japanese bewilderment, and she was lost in this battle, along with destroyer Hammond. In July, the Japanese High Command committed another blunder in landing an army division at Buna, on the east coast of Papua. The troops were to cross the Owen Stanley Mountains and attack Port Moresby. The entire division perished, more from natural causes, impossible terrain of jungle and mountains, than from enemy attack. It is significant that the Allies started their Guadalcanal invasion on August 7, just as Japanese forces were committed and bogging down in Papua. Yamamoto blundered in his evaluation of the Papua and Guadalcanal operations. Just as at Midway he had divided his forces in making a simultaneous attack on the insignificant Aleutians, so with Guadalcanal he was forced to divide his efforts between that island and the Papuan Peninsula. The piecemeal Japanese offensives were ineffective, and the consequent division of forces and effort was disastrous. On the night of August 24, while Amatsukaze was rescuing the two flyers, 7 destroyers were storming Guadalcanal with little or no result. On the next 2 days our planes attacked the island without significant effect while the mainstay of his combined fleet maneuvered aimlessly around the Solomons. Yamamoto's irresolution was becoming apparent. 4 days later, the Ichiki convoy tried again for Guadalcanal. Escorting Destroyer Division 20 took the brunt of Allied air attacks in which Asagiri was sunk and the other 3 destroyers Shirakumo, Yugiri, Amagiri were damaged. Yamamoto belatedly sent 30 fighters and 3 bombers from carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku to assist, but they arrived after the convoy had been forced to turn back to the Shortlands. Meanwhile, on a forlorn corner of Guadalcanal, the decimated vanguard unit of the Ichiki regiment cried for reinforcement. At the Shortlands the troops were again loaded into 6 destroyers next day, the 29th, and this time the 1,000 soldiers were successfully landed after dark at Taiview Point on the north-central shore of Guadalcanal. Additional reinforcement by Major General Saiken Kawaguchi's brigade, originally intended for Papua, was on the way from Truk. They arrived at Bougainville in late August, and the 1st Battalion was carried to Guadalcanal in 3 destroyers on the 30th. 8 destroyers brought in a 1,200-man contingent on the 31st. A third group was carried south by 4 destroyers on September 1, but they were turned back by stiff air opposition. The next day 20 Japanese fighter planes and 18 bombers pounded Guadalcanal, and the landing of the Kawaguchi Brigade was completed by a dozen destroyers on September 4 and 7. During all these reinforcement operations, Amatsukaze was stuck frustratingly at Truk. I knew how to use destroyers in putting troops ashore. I also knew that soldiers landed from destroyers could carry only light arms. I brooded over the fact that our lightly equipped troops, in whatever numbers, were no match for the heavily armed Americans on Guadalcanal. Truk was quiet after the Kawaguchi convoy sailed. The calm of the harbor waters and the peace of the atoll were soothing to Amatsukaze's weary crew. My men were happy, and took full advantage of our respite. The atoll abounded with fish of many varieties and every motorboat brought fresh fish back to the ship. This meant a great treat for men who had been living on tasteless canned food, and we all enjoyed our fill of sashimi, the thin strips of raw fish which are such a delicacy. One day I heard loud voices near my cabin, and went out to investigate. On the foredeck a cluster of men were gathered around a crude cage which held a falcon. The bird had been caught the day before when it perched on our mast. Moving closer I saw that a rat had been put in the cage. The falcon sat on its perch indifferently, eyes closed, while the rat scurried frantically about. The men watched in hushed silence as the bird blinked and suddenly darted at the rat, piercing out one of its eyes. Loud cheers. The bird whirred once around the cage and then deftly pierced the other eye. It was an impressive display of marksmanship and skill. With the rat blinded, the bird perched aloof again and showed no further interest. The men roared an ovation. I returned to my cabin in no mood to enjoy such a performance. To me the bird seemed too much like a skillful attack plane, and the rat a destroyer. The mainstay of the combined fleet ended 10 days of fruitless roaming and entered Truk on September 5. The spacious harbor shrank considerably when filled with these 50-odd vessels headed by the 69,100-ton battleship Yamato. For 3 days the skippers and commanders of the many fleet units met in the various flagships for detailed tactical conferences. The last meeting was held aboard Yamato with Admiral Yamamoto presiding. The preliminary discussions had dealt only with trivial matters. No one dreamed of contesting the basic operation formula already set. Criticism of basic concepts in the Imperial Navy would have impugned the top-level admirals, and brought instant dismissal of the critic. Thus all the preliminaries had been unproductive. Yamamoto was his taciturn self at the final conference. He cautioned against underestimating American fighting strength, and the session ended with the issuance of 2 simple instructions: keep the location and movements of our carriers unknown to the enemy. Make initial air assaults against the enemy as strong as possible. I returned to my ship with empty heart, feeling that the conferences had achieved nothing. Lieutenant Shimizu met me unhappily at the ramp. "What's the matter with you?" I asked. "We failed to catch a single fish today. This super fleet of ours has exterminated every fish in the atoll in just 3 days." On September 9, the combined fleet steamed out of Truk Atoll with Amatsukaze back in its original position as part of the Nagumo Task Force. Our plan was for an all-out assault on Guadalcanal on September 12 in concert with an offensive by Kawaguchi's ground forces. Instead, however, we spent the night of the 12th awaiting word that the Guadalcanal airfields were in Japanese hands. We continued impatiently to wait all through the next day. Late that night, Naval Air Headquarters at Rabaul radioed, "According to our reconnaissance, the enemy airfields at Guadalcanal seem to be held by our forces." Early next morning, several scout planes from our force returned with full reports which completely refuted the Rabaul information. The long-awaited message from Kawaguchi reached us on the 15th saying his troops had met stiff enemy opposition, sustained heavy losses, and were forced to abandon the airfields. We stamped our feet in bitter anger. In the afternoon of the same day, our patrol planes and submarines reported a large enemy task force of carriers and battleships 260 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. Lieutenant Commander Takaichi Kanashi, skipper of submarine I-19, in the first joyful message of that gloomy week, reported that he had torpedoed and sunk U.S. carrier Wasp. Our task force was ready and anxious to meet the enemy, but, after roaming idly for a week, our fuel ran low. We spent 3 days in fueling our ships some 200 miles north of Guadalcanal. Thus our best chances for engaging the enemy at this time were lost. Meanwhile, Admiral Yamamoto finally decided that at least a full division of troops was needed to reinforce Guadalcanal. So, having wasted tremendous quantities of fuel without accomplishing a thing, the combined fleet turned back to Truk. At the same time, Yamamoto ordered Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, then training 3 new carriers, in home waters, to bring his ships to Truk as soon as possible. Yamamoto had decided to delay any further operation until after the arrival of Kakuta's 2nd Air Fleet, and Kakuta did not get to Truk until October 9. Thus Japan lost 2 months of precious time following the enemy landing on Guadalcanal before the Imperial Navy was ready for a full-scale counter-offensive. Sun Tzu, the military sage of ancient China, wrote in the 11th chapter of his immortal Analects, "The skillful tactician may be likened to the Shuai Jan. Now the Shuai Jan is a snake that is found in the Chong Mountains. Strike its head and you will be attacked by its tail. Strike at its tail, and you will be attacked by its head. Strike at its middle, and you will be attacked by its head and tail both." In October 1942, Admiral Yamamoto's combined fleet was deployed for the first time in the manner of the Shuai Jan. Its head was the Nagumo Task Force, the body was Yamamoto's own battleship squadron, and the tail was the newly arrived ships under command of Admiral Kakuta. Nagumo's teeth were 29,800-ton carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku which, fully armed and loaded, actually came to some 40,000 tons. Japan's foremost carriers, they boasted the best crews and pilots. They were supported by Kakuta's 27,500-ton converted carriers Hyo, Junyo and 13,100-ton Zuiho. These were manned by newly trained crewmen and flyers, but their inexperience was offset by Kakuta's fierce aggressiveness. He was the youngest of Yamamoto's flag-rank subordinates, and a robust battler. He arrived at Truk vengeful at the loss of carrier Ryujo, which he had once commanded. It had been sunk in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons mainly because of boners by the high command of the Japanese Navy. He was still angry about the Midway debacle, too, where he had commanded the 2nd Carrier Striking Force which struck at the Aleutians. In that case the tail was extended too far to permit it to strike back when the head was attacked. By October 1942, Imperial headquarters at Tokyo had awakened to the grave situation and authorized Yamamoto to concentrate on Guadalcanal and leave the Papuan operation as it stands. He was thus given a chance to be Sun Tzu's skillful tactician, but he was not given a free hand in carrying out his chance. The army still held the initiative. The army brought its 2nd Division from Java to Rabaul and requested a joint amphibious operation to Guadalcanal. The amphibious operation meant that the army supplied troops and arms. It was up to the Navy to carry and support them. The army had half of all Japan's combat planes, but it did not offer a single one to this operation. The Japanese concept of a joint operation was quite different from that of the United States. When Guadalcanal landing operations were resumed, it was the famed Tokyo Express which carried the 2nd Division. These were ships of Rear Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's 8th Fleet at Rabaul. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's task force steamed out of Truk on October 10 to give air support to ground operations at the bitterly contested island. My ship and one other destroyer had left Truk the previous day to hit Endani, one of the northern islands in the Santa Cruz group, which we suspected of harboring enemy flying boats. We arrived there only to find the island completely evacuated. We swung back north of the Solomons and on October 15 joined the Nagumo task force, which had left Truk on the 11th. Mikawa's Tokyo Express landed the 10,600-man 2nd Army Division in 8 trips between October 2 and 11 practically without loss. The operation was a complete success. The Allies apparently recognized the Shuai-Jan deployment and took a cautious stand. The only clash was on the night of October 11 between Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto's Cruiser Division 6 and Rear Admiral Norman Scott's Task Force 64. The Japanese escort group was ambushed by TF-64 in the narrow waters between Savo and Guadalcanal Islands, in what has since become known as the Battle of Cape Esperance. The American fleet of 4 cruisers and 5 destroyers had a numerical advantage over Japan's 3 cruisers and 2 destroyers. The furious fight ended with Japan losing cruisers Furutaka sunk and Aoba damaged. TF-64 suffered the loss of destroyer Duncan sunk, and destroyer Fahrenhold and cruisers Salt Lake City and Boise damaged. This action was further costly to Japan in that Admiral Goto was killed. But the battle was valuable, too, as it cleared the American fleet from the area. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita was thus able to bring battleships Kongo and Haruna close to the Guadalcanal coast on the night of October 13 for a point-blank bombardment of Henderson Field. This was Yamamoto's first departure from his previous policy of hoarding the battleships. In all the earlier operations he had steadfastly refused to expose battleships at the fighting front. With air support available from a field just completed at the southern tip of Bougainville, Yamamoto gambled. The gamble paid off. At 2300 on October 13, the 2 27,500-ton warships closed to within 1 mile of the coast and slowed to a leisurely 18 knots. Their 16 big guns hurled 918 incendiary shells onto the airfield, which burned for a full 24 hours. Japanese troops on the island were thrilled and encouraged by this spectacle and urged the Navy to repeat the show. Yamamoto obliged, and the next night Admiral Mikawa paralleled the coast in cruisers Chokai and Kinagasa, and sprayed the airfield with 752 shells. But there were other chores for the Navy these days and nights, and an important one was the delivery of heavy arms to equip the troops. While such undertakings were in progress, the American task force worked its way back. The first effective American air attack hit on October 15, when 6 Japanese transports were sunk or put out of action. Another devastating attack came on the 17th. Early that morning 2 American destroyers carried out an audacious bombardment of supply dumps, setting them afire. 7 American bombers returned that afternoon and finished the job. The lack of motorized equipment for quickly moving landed cargo to places of safety thus cost the Japanese army dearly. Brave men cried in anguish at the sight of these precious dumps in flames. The American ships were spotted 110 miles south of Guadalcanal as they withdrew, but Kakuta's task force was 200 miles north of the island and so had no chance to engage them. When Yamamoto reinforced the area, the enemy acted precisely in the spirit enunciated by Sunts in the 7th chapter of his Analects: when fighting a powerful force, one must hit when its morale ebbs. A force's morale is keen when its sorties gradually begins to flag, and ebbs as it is ready to return to camp. One should avoid a force while its morale is keen, and one should hit when its morale ebbs. The 2 Japanese naval forces had been in the waters of the southern Solomons for more than a week without engaging any strong enemy force. Their initially high morale was waning. Meanwhile, we were waiting impatiently for an all-out offensive on Guadalcanal promised by the land troops for October 20. The army had at Guadalcanal its 2nd Division, from Sendai in northern Honshu. This outfit had occupied Nanking during the China War. Its ruthlessness had won it notoriety in the much exaggerated rape of that city. The division had an easy time invading Java, where it faced practically no opposition. but it failed completely to anticipate the rugged terrain and inclement weather of Guadalcanal. Now, with more than half of its newly landed equipment burned by the Americans, the Army troops were fighting a truly uphill battle. Despite the urgency of the Army's situation, the October 20th offensive was postponed repeatedly while the Navy stamped its feet in disgust. Ominously for Japan, Admiral Kakuta's flagship carrier Hyo suddenly developed engine trouble on October 22. Frantic efforts by her engineers failed to correct the difficulty. Her engines, originally designed for a merchant ship, were not capable of the acceleration needed for a carrier. Kakuta transferred his flag to Junyo and ordered Hyo back to Truk. He returned there at its best speed of 6 knots. The stage was being set for an American onslaught against the Japanese Navy, as much as for land action on Guadalcanal. And now Kakuta's task force had only one carrier. Zuiho had been transferred earlier to the Nagumo task force. The Sunt snake was no longer live, and its tail had lost 2/3 of its original stingers. Fresh, eager American naval forces were ready to strike. In the late afternoon of October 24, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo sat grimly in his cabin in carrier Shokaku. He had aged visibly since the Midway defeat. His hair was gray, his face sallow and deeply wrinkled. He stared at 2 pieces of paper. He had already read them dozens of times trying to puzzle out their meaning. One was a United Press story dated October 20 saying that the United States Navy was preparing for a major sea and air battle in the South Pacific. Nagumo asked himself what this meant. Was it a trap? The other sheet of paper listed enemy ships spotted by Nagumo's scout planes since the arrival of his task force in the area. The enemy carriers have been missing for a week, Nagumo mumbled. What does this mean? He stood up and slowly paced the room. The aging admiral stopped short, smiled, and thought of Sun Tzu's advice that one should avoid engaging the enemy while his morale is keen, and one should strike when his morale ebbs. There was a knock at the door, and one of Nagumo's staff officers entered. "Sir," Commander Toshitane Takata said as he saluted, "Radiomen report they're suddenly getting great numbers of undecipherable messages, evidently from nearby enemy submarines and aircraft." "Very well," Nagumo nodded. "Call Chief of Staff Kusaka quickly." Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, a heavy-set, energetic man, rushed into the room from the bridge a few moments later. "How is the fuel supply of our ships?" Nagumo asked. "They are fueling from tankers, sir," Kusaka replied. "Very well," Nagumo nodded. "Inform every skipper that a major action is imminent. Spread the formation as soon as the ships are fueled." About the same time in carrier Junyo, Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta was listening to a radio broadcast from Hawaii. The commentator was predicting a major sea and air battle soon near the Solomons. Kakuta had been considering 2 sheets of paper identical to those of Nagumo's. Kakuta snorted and turned to his air officer, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya. "Well, what do you say, Masatake?" This alert and intelligent little man, whose eyes sparkled from his impassive face burned and scarred in an air crash several years earlier, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Sir, October 27th is America's Navy Day." Kakuta, a burly battler, jumped to his feet and roared with laughter. "Very good, very good. Let's hustle and prepare a nice Navy Day gift for those cocky Yanks." On board Shokaku, Nagumo still conferred with Kusaka. "What is our deployment now?" Nagumo asked. "Battleships Hiei and Kirishima, cruiser Chikuma and 7 destroyers of Rear Admiral Koki Abe are ahead of us, 60 to 80 miles to the south," Kusaka replied. "Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara's cruiser Tone and destroyer Teratsuki are 200 miles to the east. Rear Admiral Kakuta's force is 300 miles to the west." "Any reports on enemy carriers?" "No, sir." The ensuing brief silence was broken by Nagumo, who spoke hesitantly, meditatively, as if thinking aloud. "At Midway, the enemy struck us at a time of his choosing. Now, too, there is no doubt that the enemy pinpoints our position as if on a chessboard, but we are running blind." Commander Takata, a staff officer, ventured to speak. "Excuse me, sir, may I suggest sending a message to Yamato, the Combined Fleet flagship, then at Truk asking for instructions?" Nagumo was silent. Kusaka closed his eyes for a few moments, then opened them and said, "All right, Takata, take this message, from Kusaka, 1st Air Fleet Chief of Staff, To Vice Admiral Mato Mugaki, Combined Fleet Chief of Staff. May I suggest halting our southward advance until we receive definite word that the Army has captured Guadalcanal airfields. There seems to be a possibility of our being trapped if we continue going like this. Nagumo listened intently and nodded his concurrence. The message was sent and a grim silence descended on the cabin. Nagumo and his staff settled down to wait for an answer. My destroyer Amatsukaze was cruising 2,000 meters to port of flagship Shokaku. We were part of the ring formation of 1 cruiser and 9 destroyers which surrounded the flagship and carriers Zuikaku and Zuiho of Carrier Division 1. Nagumo and Kusaka had learned a bitter and costly lesson at Midway, and they were taking full precautions this time. Shortly after midnight the long-awaited reply arrived from Truk. From Ugaki to Kusaka. Your striking force will proceed quickly to the enemy direction. The operation orders stand, without change. Kusaka bit his lip. Takada groaned. Nagumo snorted, then said calmly, all right, start fueling the carriers. The 3 carriers slowed down to take on oil in the dark of night. By daybreak of October 25 the painstaking process was almost completed when an orderly dashed into the admiral's cabin with a message. Nagumo was dozing. He awakened instantly and read the report from one of the patrol planes supposed to be circling above his carriers. I have shot down an enemy plane, apparently a scout. Nagumo jumped to his feet. Cut refueling. Turn the carriers around and head due north. At 0530 the Nagumo and Kakuta forces retreated at 20 knots to the north-northeast. As soon as Nagumo heard that the enemy scout plane had been shot down he ordered the drastic turn, something he failed to do at Midway because he decided the enemy had obtained full information about the strength and composition of his force. The Americans failed to foresee this decision of Nagumo's, and a few hours later their planes searched vainly where his ships should have been. Nagumo sent dozens of scout planes in all directions. But they sighted no enemy carriers. They did, however, see and report 2 Allied battleships, 5 cruisers and 12 destroyers. After running northward for 12 hours, Nagumo again directed fueling for all his ships, including the 3 carriers. At 1900 the 2 Japanese task forces reversed course and headed south at 20 knots. It was a warm moonlit night. On weatherdecks, however, a breeze flapped flags and dried out sweaty clothes. Nagumo was again huddled with staff officers in the heavy atmosphere of his cabin. Everyone was glum. We must presume that the enemy contact has failed, one said. From the enemy radio activity, they may still be in contact with our vanguard units. Nagumo closed his eyes, as though in pain. Kusaka wiped sweat from his face. Commander Takada squirmed. At 50 minutes past midnight, October 26, every alarm sounded on carrier Shokaku. Air raid, air raid. Staff officers jumped. Takada dashed to the bridge in time to see 4 water plumes rising on the starboard side of carrier Zuikaku, some 5,000 meters astern of Shokaku. He held his breath until the water pillars subsided, and he saw that Zuikaku was still safe. The bombs had fallen at least 300 meters away from the carrier. Takada almost fell down the ladder racing to the admiral's cabin to report these events. Nagumo and Kusaka were still in their chairs. When Takada reported what he had seen, the 2 admirals looked at each other and said exactly the same thing. Let's turn around. From the bridge of Amatsukaze I saw Shokaku's signal light blink. All ships turned 180 degrees to starboard, and then the big black ship started its abrupt turn. A second blinker light order followed shortly, speed of advance, 24 knots. And the third message came at 0130, as the turn was completed. All ships of this force steady on course 0 degrees. The moon vanished into the clouds and an uneasy hour passed while we braced for an all-out attack by the enemy. Not a single enemy appeared. It was becoming evident that the plane which had hit and so poorly at Zuikaku had committed a grave blunder. It had sounded an alarm, a most vital alarm to which the Japanese responded promptly, to the distinct disadvantage of the enemy. Dawn of October 26 was to break at 0345. In the pre-dawn darkness, red-shaded flashlights moved to and fro on Shokaku's deck. It was plain that all hands were busy in the carrier. At 0215 our radio picked up a report that the vanguard unit, then running far to our rear, had catapulted 7 reconnaissance planes. 30 minutes later, 13 scouts zoomed up from the decks of our carriers. Then the whole fleet turned about again and headed once more to the south. By morning's light I saw Shokaku pilots near their planes, ready for battle at a moment's notice. Admiral Nagumo was clearly visible on the bridge, easily identified by his snow-white gloves. About 5 the radio room voice tube suddenly came to life as Ensign Hideo Shoji shouted excitedly. Shokaku scout plane reports a large enemy force at KHI-7. Force consists of 1 Saratoga-class carrier and 15 other ships heading northwestward. 4:50 hours. I was speechless at discovering that KH-17 was 210 miles distant on bearing 125 degrees. We had figured that the enemy would be directly ahead of us, or even slightly to the right. Cold chills ran down my spine. My officers took a look at the chart and groaned. Similar consternation was being felt on the bridge of every Japanese ship. Everyone suddenly realized how narrowly we had escaped an enemy trap. Had we maintained a southern advance without the 2 turnarounds and the northern run, the Americans could have struck at us from the rear and battered us into a disastrous defeat. On Shokaku's bridge, Admiral Nagumo grinned for the first time in many hours. He ordered an immediate air sortie, and planes began rolling down the deck. Everyone had learned at Midway that the slightest hesitation could cause a debacle. Shokaku and Zuikaku launched 40 bombers and 27 fighters within 15 minutes. Their speedy action was in marked contrast to the sluggish Ryujo operations I had witnessed 2 months earlier in this same area.